G'day ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to War Thunder with Mags. Today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of the new aircraft from the Fleet Air Arm and getting my first impressions on each of them. And we're going to start off with the Mk.I Fairy Firefly. Now I'm going to be honest with you here, this is going to be a very short first impressions. The Mk.I Fairy Firefly is a good aircraft, but not a very effective one. So how do you get a good but not very effective aircraft? Well, the first thing to look at is the handling characteristics of the aircraft itself. The Mk.I Fairy Firefly, even stock, is, well, honestly, it's quite beautiful to fly. It handles very well, it's very good at low altitudes, it's fast, it can get to a target zone very rapidly, and it can exit that target zone. It is a fairly manoeuvrable aircraft too. It's not the most manoeuvrable aircraft you will encounter, but it's more than enough to be able to defend itself if it needs to do so. In terms of ordnance loadout, dead stock it has absolutely none available, but once you get those upgrades done, it does have a decent selection of ground attack ordnance. In terms of cannon armament, it's got 420mm Spanos, which is a great armament to have and quite effective in ground attack. The last trick the Firefly has going for it, and I forget the name of this particular flap arrangement, but is the way its flaps work. They detach themselves from the bottom of the wing and extend out underneath, creating almost a second wing arrangement. This increases the stability of the aircraft, making it extremely easy to accurately put bombs on the ground, and also very easy to put guns on target for ground targets to eliminate them. The firing platform becomes beautifully stable. I should also add that this particular flap arrangement makes the aircraft extremely stable in carrier landings. This is possibly one of the easiest aircraft I've ever encountered for putting down on a carrier. So far this has all been sounding very complimentary to the aircraft, so why do I say that it's not particularly effective? Well, it comes down to the armament and its endurance in combat. The first thing to note is the Fairy Firefly does not come out of the box with any ground attack ordnance. All you get is your cannon armament, which is 420mm Spanos. Now that in particular is great, but a stock aircraft means stock ammunition belts, and the British standard ammunition belts are friggin' awful. They carry practice rounds. One of their main rounds is a tracer. You have one shell out of 3 that's going to be effective, and that particular shell is not actually all that good for ground attack. Add to that the Mk.I Fairy Firefly only has 240 rounds of cannon ammunition on board between those guns. This gives you a sustained fire time of about 6 seconds. The Fairy Firefly in standard format actually can't overheat its own guns. It will run out of ammunition before its guns have a chance to overheat. And there, as you can see, 5 ground targets destroyed, and I've only got 5 rounds of cannon ammunition. Now, I did attack some heavier targets, attacking those ships first, and I did not exercise perfect trigger discipline. However, doing both, the best I've managed to pull out of these guns so far is between 8 to 10 kills. That's all you've got an ammunition load for, and you have no bombs, so once you're out, that's it, you're out. Time to go home. Now, the first basic ground ordnance loads are very limited on bombs, so you really only add 1 or 2 additional attacks to the aircraft by adding this ordnance on board. So you're only going to extend that out by 1 to 2 kills. The bombs are generally large enough you can take on light shipping. You wouldn't be taking on anything much larger than that. So this limitation means its actual time on target to get kills is very limited, and there's not a huge amount that it's actually capable of doing. Why, the plane is very fast getting to the target and very fast getting out, and in fact, I was never approached by a Japanese fighter in this, despite just blowing up 5 targets directly underneath them as they were climbing in. This plane was more than capable of just exiting out of the combat area and disappearing. That rapid strike ability doesn't really help this plane much when you've got 24 ground targets that need to be destroyed in order to be able to win the match. As a ground attacker bomber in realistic battles, the plane needs to have the capability of being able to get in and smash out, at least 15-20 targets at a time. This plane just doesn't. Honestly, in terms of a ground attack vehicle, the Boston Premium or the DB7, the Havoc, even the Wirraway is actually a better choice for ground attack, simply because it has more ammunition, so it has more time on target to kill. So what about air combat capabilities? Well, it's still got that very short amount of ammunition to engage in a sustained air fight, but it's actually far worse at this role. A lot of people have been saying that this aircraft is actually incredibly good in a dogfight. They're wrong. The aircraft itself is very manoeuvrable, but its biggest problem is it's heavy in a dogfight. Now, it's very fast, but it's not as fast as dedicated straight-line fighters. Its climb rate isn't good enough to get a good altitude advantage to use its weight in a boom and zoom capability. Its maneuverability leans it to being a turn fighter, but it is nowhere near fast enough and doesn't have the energy retention to be able to run a sustained turn fight. Its maneuverability is good enough that if it gets in trouble, it should be able to survive long enough for somebody to come and save it, if anybody is coming at all. But that's about all it's good for. What I'm seeing in realistic battle is this particular variant of the Fairy Firefly seems to be surviving in air combat based around people's inexperience with it. Fighters encountering and aren't entirely sure what are they dealing with. Is it a Typhoon? Is it a big Spitfire? What is it? And they're making mistakes around the aircraft that is getting themselves killed. It's not so much the effectiveness of the aircraft as it is the inexperience of the pilots fighting it. Now, all of that being said, I do actually see a use and a future for this aircraft in War Thunder and being quite effective, just not in air realistic battle. Or, I should say, not in pure air realistic battle. An extremely fast to and from target, extremely stable ground attacker that's extremely easy to fly with a good bomb load, able to surgically strike targets on the ground. This thing is going to be heavily used in the mid-tiers of combined arms battles once the British tank tech tree is incorporated into War Thunder. Its speed, maneuverability and stability will allow it to slip in over the top of any of the ground forces maps and pinpoint deliver their bombs directly onto tank targets that are threatening control points or team members on the ground, and the aircraft's maneuverability coupled with those 420mm Hispanos are going to give it just enough firepower that it should be able to eliminate other bombers that are in the area and putting your tanks at risk. That's the future I see for the Fairy Firefly Mk.I. Once tanks are incorporated into the game, its endurance is actually not going to be so much of an issue. The limited amount of cannon ammunition is only going to be used on air targets anyway. There are no real soft targets to be able to fire at effectively in a ground forces map. You really want to save that ammunition for dealing with other bombers that are in the air. The limited bomb load won't be so much of a problem either. It'll be more than sufficient for taking out tanks that are really putting your team at risk. And the trip back to the runway to get a reload isn't actually that far, so it's not a problem. Yeah, I'm almost positive this plane is going to be heavily used in just about every single mid-tier British Ground Forces line that anybody assembles. At the very least, I know it'll be definitely going into mine. So, next up we have the Sea Hurricane Mk.I C, and what a little beast this thing is. Error 2, Battle Rating 3. Now, when I did my review of the patch on the test server, I said that I thought this plane was going to be a little seal clubber. Turns out that I was only half right. It does have some problems, and we're going to go over those now. So first, the plane's strengths. Well, obviously, it has 420mm Hispano cannons, and unlike the Fairy Firefly that I covered a few moments ago, this thing has 500 rounds of ammunition. This has the ammunition load the Firefly wishes it had. Second thing, maneuverability. Boom by an E3 there was easily able to roll over and get guns back on target for a quick shot, take it up in the vertical, quick burst down, and there we go, another good solid hit. Stand back on the elevators to bring the nose around, fall on the tail of the E3, and why this guy is able to pull out of my range fairly easily, he is continuing a turn, and that is the worst mistake that he could ever possibly make, because there is no way known he's ever going to outmaneuver me. Level out and have a quick look around. Where's the enemy coming from? We have a 110 diving in, so I'll just roll it over, stand on the elevators, and I'm back underneath him, and there is nothing that he can do about it to get on me. Falls in behind. Yeah, I'll just start barrel rolling the aircraft. Let's see what happens. He tries to follow me through, and I am easily outmaneuvering him. 2 rotations, and I'm on his tail. Fire a quick burst, he realises he's in trouble and banks off, opens up the throttles, and flies away. And what you've just seen is a perfect example of what your fights will be like in a Sea Hurricane 1C, and where its strengths truly lie. This is one of the most manoeuvrable monoplane fighters in War Thunder. It is insanely quick at turning, it is able to change direction extremely rapidly, and with 420mm Hispano cannons with 500 rounds of ammunition, if you are silly enough to engage it in a close range turn fight, it will murder you, and it should. So, those are its strengths. What are its weaknesses? Well, its climb rate is distinctly average at only around 3,300 feet a minute. It's, if you give it enough time, it'll get up there, but it will get outcloned by a lot of fighters that it's going to be flying alongside. Its high altitude performance is also lacking as well. Above 10,000 feet, it is, well, it's a pig, it barely flies. It really needs to stay low to the ground. Top speed isn't much either. This aircraft, fully upgraded on the stat card, only reads in at about 530-540 kilometers an hour. However, I've never ever hit it in level flight. You're looking at maybe 450 into a shallow dive, but you won't be able to maintain it for long because you won't be at a high enough altitude to be able to do so. Another weakness is its energy retention. You can see in this turn here how rapidly the Hurricane is dropping speed as it's going into a tight bank. This is pretty much the nature of it. It has a powerful enough engine at about 1,000 horsepower to be able to get its speed back to about 300 kilometers an hour relatively easy at low altitudes, but it will constantly be dropping below. This means the aircraft is always going to be slow, and in fact mobility, speed, is the biggest weakness of this aircraft. Piloting this aircraft, especially on the larger realistic battle maps, is you're going to have to use a lot of judgment and put the plane where you think it needs to be before you know whether or not the enemy is going to be there or not. Once you've done that, you're going to have to hope the enemy actually shows up, because this aircraft is so slow that moving from one point in the battlefield to another on the larger maps is actually a pretty major problem. By the time you get to where the fight is, chances are the fight will be over or it will have moved to a new location. You'll constantly be chasing targets. In fact, let's have a really good look at an example of this right now. So, we're on the Sicily map. Now, being a new patch, I expected there to be a few ground attackers floating around. I decided to go for the tanks on the north side of the lake in the middle of the Sicily map first, and it turned out to be the right choice. We've got a Focke-Wulf 190 coming in, there is a Doe 217 floating around, we've got a premium Yak in the area. So I'm basically smack bang in the middle of a bunch of ground attackers, and with 420mm cannons and this much ammunition, hitting ground attackers, so higher durability aircraft, ground attackers and bombers, this plane is almost perfectly suited for taking this kind of aircraft out. So my initial thought was to take on the Focke-Wulf 200, but it's turning away. Doe 217's looking to engage. At this level, Doe 217s are actually an incredibly dangerous aircraft, so I'm going to get rid of it first. Just take the Hurricane straight vertical, pull it straight back around, and you see how easy it was to fall in on this Doe 217's tail. It never really had a chance to stop it here, and despite being an incredibly durable aircraft, 420mm Hispanos will absolutely pull a Doe 217 to pieces. Look back around, the Focke-Wulf 200 is heading back to base, it's out of the area, but I spot two BF-110s at low altitude, so let's go after them next. Pushing out past 500 kilometers an hour using what little altitude I did actually manage to get in the time before beginning to engage targets to rapidly close in on these two guys. At the rate that they're flying and the distance they're flying apart from one another, I say it's highly likely these guys are in a squad and on comms. Pick out the first target, take a lead, pull it apart, engage the second target, fall in behind, use the maneuverability to undercut so it can't get guns on me, pull into the vertical. Just watch it, just hang in the vertical a bit, back off on the throttles, so I don't want to overshoot him and put myself in front of his. Good solid hit, I'm on his tail now. And at this point there's nothing this poor BF-110 pilot can really do to save himself. His plane is faster than the Sea Hurricane 1C, but its acceleration isn't high enough for him to be able to open a gap faster than my 20mm shells can intercept him, and in fact there goes his elevator, so he's out of the match. He couldn't outmaneuver me, he doesn't have the speed control to be able to get behind me, he was dead. He just didn't know it until he hit the ground. So, 3 kills in a little over 60 seconds. That's pretty awesome, but where does that leave the Hurricane now? Well, honestly, that's the end of the battle for me. The rest of the fights in this map are happening at distances about 10 to 15 kilometers away. By the time I manage to close distance to one of these fights, it's either over or it's moved somewhere else, another 10 or 15 kilometers out. The Hurricane is simply not fast enough to be able to get to these battles. A few battles are happening at high altitude, which the Hurricane doesn't have a high enough climb rate to be able to get to them, and once it gets there, it just doesn't have the high altitude performance to be able to engage. The Hurricane is lethal, but it needs its enemies to come to it and fight it at low altitude. If nobody's interested in engaging the 1C, this is what happens. There was really nothing else I could do in this match, so I just returned to base, landed, grabbed a rearm on ammunition, and waited for the match to end. There was nothing else that I could really do. You could strafe and attack ground targets in it, but that's really the limitation of your capabilities at this point in the match. It actually reminds me quite a bit of the Boomerang. It's incredibly maneuverable, it's a very durable aircraft, it can take quite a lot of hits to actually bring one of the Hurricanes down. I had one match against the Japanese where I took, I don't know how many 50 caliber rounds from a Japanese premium Corsair, and it didn't kill me. The plane was a wreck, but it just kept flying, it just didn't care. It has a massive amount of firepower for its battle rating, and it's got a very good ammunition load, so it's got a great amount of endurance. in those fights, but it just doesn't have the speed, the climb rate, or the high altitude performance to enact as an interceptor. Much like the boomerang, I recommend you fly this plane sort of like an area denial weapon. Put it somewhere where you know the enemy team is going to be, a series of bombing targets, a series of ground targets that you know they always attack. Sit the plane directly on top of it and just wait, and when anything goes into that zone, kill it. Anyways, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed this video. Click like if you do, subscribe if you want to see more, fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies.